See a lot of familiar faces. Super excited to talk grammar. We'll start in like a minute, maybe less, because I have a lot to say. Lots of good grammar. But I know some folks are racing over from whatever their last workshop was. Okay, I can't wait anymore. We're just starting. So grammar, super excited. Grammar in 7 minutes a day. It's going to be very, very fun. Um, Basically, what we're going to try to do in this half hour, I think we can do it, is I want you to walk away with a few things. I want you to have a sense of our new grammar curriculum we put out, what that looks like, just on a very like quick practical level. I want you to have a sense of the research base that's underlying that work. And then mostly I want us to spend time on what those big blueprint methods are that we're using over and over again there. That means that you could use those methods whether you are using our actual curriculum or not at all. So this will be helpful to you no matter what position you are in that sense. So that is our plan for the next half an hour. So first, just the big picture around what this content is that I'm talking about. So in the new 3-5 reading unit or writing units of study that just came out this summer, each of the grades comes with a book like this, a whole spiral bound book that is a grammar extensions curriculum, basically going along with all the writing units. And in each of those, what you see is that basically you have a 5 to 7 minute a day extension. And we really, really, really mean it with 5 to 7 minutes a day. I've taught these a lot of different places and contexts, and I feel pretty confident in saying that these are legitimately 5 to 7 minutes. We're not talking like some kind of big, um, it actually takes 15, but we're going to call it 5 for fun. It really is real, I think. There's one for every session of the unit, so it's integrated with the unit. So if you were teaching, third grade information writing, and it has 21 sessions, there's 21 grammar extensions that go along with that. Doesn't mean you have to teach all of them, but it does mean you have lots and lots of content to use. And then each unit has all these things, and I'll just quickly flash through to show you. There's a quick guide that kind of defines the main grammar principles that are taught in that unit, which is super helpful because even if you are a person who loves grammar and feels like you know grammar really well, which I thought that I was, there'd be stuff that I was like, I have to Google this and make some little notes for myself before I start talking to children about this. So hopefully this will save you a little bit of time. It also will then have the sessions, right? Each of the little lessons. And this is literally a full lesson for whichever session that is. So we've structured them like the Rally Try It. They're not really small groups. They're probably going to be more whole class, but it's structured where basically the idea is we want kids to be active. So very, very early in the lesson, like immediately or in the first minute, kids are doing something, right? They're engaging in some way. You'll see these ongoing assessment boxes in each bend where it's just sort of a list of lenses you could take on as you look at students writing at that point, what you could be checking for, what you could be planning to assess, what you could be coaching kids on. And then you'll see these sort of like ending review type things. So in one grade, for example, we often use this news reporter structure where at the end of the bend, they've learned a lot about, in this case, it's verb tenses of positives and adjective phrases, and they're like talking to each other about it. So it's just a little tiny review piece at the end of each bend. In other grades, it's I think there's one where it's you're teaching like a younger kid. There's one where you're like making a notebook page. There's different kinds of ways of just building in sort of cumulative review. So you'll see that throughout. And then you'll see this coaching guide. The blue line is irrelevant. That's just, I took this picture before it went to press, but it's a coaching guide. So this I found super helpful because like if in this case, if you've been teaching kids about using commas to write list sentences, and then you're walking around during writing workshop and you see that kids are not doing that, some sentences that you could use, some things you could be looking for, so that the big goal is that all of this grammar feels like it's supportive of your writing workshop and not extra. Like that the purpose of teaching grammar is to use it, to write with it, not just to have it in your head. So we want to make as many connections as possible to how does this help your writing? How does this make you a better writer? But I want to now give you a little sense of like what's the research base behind this. I'm a huge nerd about grammar research, so if you would like to email me and we can chat more about like all the specifics and the, you know, citations and links and whatever, that if you want to dig in more, I'm going to put my email in the chat right now. I would love to do that, but I'm just going to give you sort of three big ideas in synthesis and name a few people that we studied and then move on from there. So when I looked across all of this, I felt like three big ideas were coming up over and over. One is that grammar makes sense throughout the writing process. It doesn't need to wait till editing. And for me, this is important in a philosophical sense, but also a logistical sense. Because I don't know about you, but for me, a lot of times the issue with grammar being taught like in the editing phase was, you know, by the time editing rolls around, everyone's tired. It's about to be vacation. You're like, okay, well, I'm not going to hold this unit over vacation. So we're going to finish this. So you've got 10 seconds to edit. Let's go. Moving on, publishing parties at noon, moving right ahead, right? It's hard to fit it in. It can feel like an afterthought to you and the kids if we're not careful. But also, of course, you know, I think it's a helpful message for kids to see that grammar is actually something you use anytime you write. It's not just a fixing up, right? So we write sentences because they help us to express our ideas, not because we want to avoid getting points off. So that, you know, our immediate way of solving that is that literally there could be a grammar extension for any given lesson in the unit that could be sort of added on or tucked in or taught during a word study block or a morning meeting or a weird 15 minutes you have before lunch or whatever it might be. But again, even if you're not using that curriculum, the idea of thinking I need to plan deliberately to have some grammar practice and or instruction throughout, you know, maybe it's while they're generating in their notebook and like while they're drafting and talking about it as part of revision and not just that end piece. The very biggest thing is this second piece, not taught in isolation. There's just gobs and gobs of research that this is bad. Like teaching grammar in isolation is bad. And I know we've all heard this. You've all heard it. You've probably said it, right? Two like particular citations that really have grabbed my notice in this, that both basically said decontextualized grammar skills had a negative effect size. So not just it didn't help, but actually harmed. I don't know if it sucked the grammar right out of kids' heads or what, but this came up in this Writing Next study looking at like middle school writers. It came up in this meta-analysis that Steve Graham is a big name in writing instruction in general, and he's done a fair amount with grammar. So I think the trick here, because I often say this and teachers are like, yeah, of course, like we all know this. And what does it look like? What does isolation mean? Because that doesn't necessarily mean that you're only teaching grammar like when it naturally crops up or when a kid is naturally curious about it, right? Sometimes you're introducing stuff to them that they wouldn't have thought to be wondering or curious about. And that's great and fine and probably needed. What it does mean, I think, is that you don't want to just teach the grammar for grammar, fill out the worksheet, and then, you know, at a different time of day, bell rings. Now we're in writing and we're doing writing and we're just going to forget that that grammar ever happened. And I think kids have a tendency to do that. Not that you're telling them to do that, but kids have a tendency to see it as like, oh, that was grammar. That's done. I did my worksheet and now I'm doing writing class and I'm not going to use periods. They're not necessarily seeing the impact. We've all had students like this. I remember one student who I was conferring with him and I'm like, so why don't you have any periods in this whole long essay? And he's like, oh, I'm just going to go back at the end and put the periods in. And I was like, dude, I cannot express what a bad idea this is. Like, how are you going to remember? I'm so curious about this. But we've all had kids who say something similar. And a lot of that, I think, is because they're seeing writing and grammar as two totally separate things. Um, so I don't think it means that you should never isolate a grammar skill to talk about or to like zoom in on, but that you've got to put it right back into the context. Like you could pull it out to look at the same way you could pull out, you know, writing dialogue and just study that. But then right away you put it back in, because we're not writing dialogue just for the sake of it. The other way that this comes up, I find, is that when we talk about how grammar is going in our buildings, a lot of times we hear things like, you know, oh my gosh, the kids don't even put capital letters, they don't do this, they don't do that, right? And super frustrating. But a lot of the times, if you were to go into a school and give a kid a worksheet that said, fix the capitalization, and there was a bunch of stuff that wasn't capitalized, they could probably get 100% on that worksheet, or a pretty good score. They don't apply it. And so that, to me, tells there's a transfer problem. They can do it in isolation, but it's not carrying over. So that suggests that we need to do something a little bit different with our teaching. And then finally, I think we really want kids seeing grammar as a tool for communication and craft, and not just a right or wrong. Like, they make choices as writers all the time. And one of those choices needs to be, what kind of sentences am I writing? What kind of punctuation am I using? And I think they need to see that and understand that concept way at the beginning. Lots of times we hear, you know, oh, they learn the rules and then break them. They're never going to fully learn the rules, right? There's never a magic time that we're like, now Ellen, you can break the rules, right? Because she never makes any mistakes. It's more that, you know, kids can understand what their purpose is and make those choices, not so much that we want them to be like, yay, I get to break rules now. Um, Often it's more that it wasn't really a rule to begin with, and we're just helping them see that their choices matter to their audience. So I think you'll find that throughout all of this, that we're going to do all these activities, you should see elements of these things coming up. And again, I could talk forever about research behind grammar, so email me if you would appreciate that. But I will spare the rest of you. So let's think about some of the methods you'll find in our grammar work. And again, this is where you could apply this to any writing program, any grammar curriculum you want. Here, I would say, are 6 of the most common, like, blueprint methods that we use over and over again. And we're going to go through, and I'm just going to give you some quick, fun examples of all of these that I think will be enjoyable and fun. And you could imagine which of these you feel like already you are doing in your schools, and which you're like, oh, I would like to add that in. I'd like to like give that a try. And if you're someone who has these books and is going, like, getting ready to use them, you might be thinking, oh, now I understand what this method means, or now I see, like, this is a part I want to not skip. So sorts. You all are probably familiar with lots of sorts: word study sorts, phonics sorts, spelling sorts, vocabulary sorts. Let's throw grammar in the mix. Grammar sorts. So in this example, we might be sorting these words into linking verbs or action verbs. So I might teach a lesson where I'm saying, guys, you've been doing so much great work with verbs, and we've learned how verbs show action. But I want to tell you that there is another kind of verb, and it doesn't really show an action. So I could just explain it. We could act out, like, try to act out sleeping. Okay, now try to act out is. And all of you would be like, we can't. So doing a little bit of direct instruction, but quick, fun. And now a lot of the work is going to be, I'm going to give you and your partner or your group some verbs and this chart. You're going to sort them into linking verbs or action verbs. And remember, linking verbs are da 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 da, right? As with any sort, the annoying thing about sorts is all the cutting. So it's not always a method that everyone loves, but I do feel like it's so powerful that sometimes it's worth the cutting, you know, or you get a kid who loves to cut. I know Jamboard is no longer, but a lot of people have switched over to doing things digitally, like Fig Jam, or doing it on a smart board. So there's digital ways to make it less annoying. But I do think sorting is just a powerful, powerful instructional move, including for grammar, if there's ways to make it logistically more feasible. Then we might think a little bit about sentence combining and expanding. I'm going to show you a couple examples of this. Sentence combining and expanding is, interestingly enough, one of the grammar like teaching methods that has been the most studied. There's just tons of research around how effective it is. Some of you might be familiar with the book, The Writing Revolution. They use a lot of sentence combining and expanding. There's a whole book on different ways of doing sentence combination and expansion. So it's a pretty powerful method, and I found it to also be pretty fun. So one example here, like you see on the screen now, you could almost think about what I would consider like a closed combining. That's a term I'm making up here, but sentence combining where I'm directing you to try a particular thing. So we've learned about these different words that you can use to create compound sentences. I'm going to give you these pairs of sentences and these words, and you're going to create sentences with it. You're going to combine the pairs to make one sentence using one of these words. So if I want you to practice a very specific thing, I might give you something like this, right? Where you've got two jobs. One is the like actual combining the punctuation, the putting it together, and one is picking the best word to use, and playing around with how that sounds. I could also do some sort of, I guess, open sentence combining, which is for years one of the things that I have done in classes, even before we were at a point of creating, lessons like this. So putting 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 simple sentences on the board and saying, I would say to kids, all right, guys, you've got a minute with your groups or 3 minutes with your groups. Figure out a way to combine all this information into one sentence, write it on a Post-it, go. With slightly older kids, right? 3rd graders might struggle with this at first, or maybe you just use simpler sentences and fewer of them. But I have found this to be really fun and helpful in a few particular ways, including one is that inevitably, in this case, for example, there's going to be some kids who say, Big Red Lollipop is a book by Roxana Khan, comma, it is a picture book, comma, and it is about family and understanding. Great, good job. But some kid is going to be like, I know, let's move the order around. Or maybe they know how to make an appositive and they put Big Red Lollipop, comma, by Roxana Khan, right? Or they just say a picture book by Roxana Khan. Like some kid's going to do something innovative, which sets you up to then use their example later to teach the whole class. And it can be a nice window into how they're thinking about sentences and just practice. Sometimes during a writing workshop, this could be my mid-workshop or a share. In this case, I'm imagining I'm in a literary essay unit and I want them thinking about sentence structure, but maybe that's not the focus of the lesson, but I could have it as a fun game, as a mid-workshop, get them talking, get them thinking about sentences, and then say, when you're looking at your own writing, see if there's places you want to combine your sentences. So it could be a very light touch. Or I could use it as the launch to a bigger, we're going to really study this. We could also do some expanding instead of just combining. Here's an example. It's kind of fun. Poor grandma. Giving kids a starter sentence. And then in this case, if we're working on prepositions, like, guys, we've been working on prepositions for a couple days now. You've learned a ton of them and seen them in your books. Let's create some sentences. So with your partner, grandma was snoring, add a preposition and add the rest of the sentence. Make up a bunch of these sentences. Go. And that's going to be fun. And you could follow up and say, okay, now we're going to change it. And now we're going to try a different preposition, or now I'm going to give you a different sentence, right? So lots of different ways to get some more attempts for kids. So I could do some expanding work with whatever it is that I want them to focus on. Spot the difference is a really fun one. Just also because it's very quick and easy to do. So I'll show you 2 versions. In this case, if you take a look and you think, all right, we're going to play spot the difference. So what's the difference in these 2 sentences? And you all are picking up that the only difference is right here. The sky was growing dark. I thought it might rain. First of all, I mean, that's a run-on, I think a comma splice. Not 100% sure, pretty sure. The second one, you've got that so, you've made it a sentence, right? So this could be a way to practice if you've been working on that skill of creating sentences like this, and helping them to recognize what is a super common error when kids are doing this, of just putting the comma to combine the sentence. You could also do spot the difference, where it isn't like one is right and one is wrong. So in this case, these are both correct, but this would be if I wanted to teach kids or highlight to kids that you can put the dialogue tag before or after the dialogue. And maybe I even want to highlight that it changes the punctuation. But here I'm like, name all the differences with your partner, not that one is right and one is wrong. So it feels like one of those pretty endlessly transferable sorts of games. I use game very loosely in my life and in this workshop. You know, it's not Uno, but it's pretty fun. So you could do some spot the difference. Of course, you could do work with mentor text. That's powerful. And a lot of you are familiar with or use Jeff Anderson's work in like Patterns of Power or his earlier books. You know, he's big on the mentor sentence work, which we also love. And there's a lot of that reflected in our units as well. One thing that's interesting, so when we're thinking about mentor text, first of all, we could be thinking about, you know, excerpts from read aloud books or trade books. We could be thinking about teacher written mentor text, student written mentor text. There could be lots of types of mentor texts. And then we could also think about what we do with them. So obviously, there's lots of room to do some like directed inquiry into a page of a mentor text. So I listed sort of 4 questions I could imagine asking kids just from this page to do a little inquiry with this book from Last Snap on Market Street, depending on my goal. So it could just be find all the verbs, right? Or labeling what makes a sentence. Or maybe I want them to zoom in on this sentence. Everyone on the bus clapped, even the boys in the back, because we're going to talk about that. Or I think it's an interesting question to say, why didn't he combine those two? Why did he choose to make 2 simple sentences instead of, you know, Nana glanced at the coin in CJ's palm and he dropped it in the man's hat? So getting into even a bit of author like decision making and craft. Obviously, these are just examples, right? You could do whatever with it, but I think doing an inquiry is like a nice, not necessarily easy, but very easy for you as a teacher to think through. And you've got so many mentor sentences because you've got all these beautiful books that you're reading with kids. Of course, you could also do more open inquiry of just what do you notice, which would be helpful if you're like towards the end of something. Maybe we've done tons of work on verbs for a week. So when I say, what do you notice about the verbs? Maybe some kids are noticing that they're very precise, and maybe some kids are noticing that they're past tense. So you could do a more open inquiry. This is like a middle school example. You could take a sentence from a read aloud book and just ask kids to talk about what they notice, and then help them to name kind of like, what's the grammar concept? Why do we use it? Have them imitate the sentence. You could do any one of those things underneath it, right? Imitating a cool sentence can work often really well. So it could be a more open-ended inquiry into a grammar concept, into a mentor text. Also, one thing that pops up in these units a lot that I really liked and will borrow in other grades is the idea of using a mentor text page or section as a way to show what you know. So almost like a little bit of, again, a summative piece. So it could be, take this page of our mentor text, use it to teach your partner about commas, or to teach your partner about what makes a sentence, right? It can be nice because if you are going to do one of those, like, let's sum up what we learned, teach someone, that's a pretty hard thing to do, right? It's one thing to say, I'm going to teach you what a verb is, but like, teach you what we know about commas, that feels like a big ask. But if you're like, use this page to teach about commas, then a kid could say, well, we learned a lot of different ways to use commas, like, for example, to add in more information, like moving like a snake, or to separate adjectives like soft rotting flesh. It's a little early for that particular imagery, but there we go. So that could be another use for mentor texts. I mentioned two other like blueprint methods on that first slide that I kind of have treated a bit separately, that I'll name now. One is oral rehearsal, and I kind of pull that separately because there's sometimes that really like the main method that's happening in a particular lesson is just oral rehearsal. But you've also already noticed probably that almost all of these lessons kind of rely on kids practicing out loud. Sometimes they're practicing in writing or on a whiteboard or in a notebook or whatever, but we rely a lot on practicing verbally with partners, partly because of time, right? If you want to keep the time tight, that's going to go faster. But also, if you think about just the amount of practice you get, if I'm asking you to write a sentence, there's a limit to how much you can write quickly, especially if you're a third grader or you're a kid who writes slowly or has OT issues. Like, you'll get one sentence in, but if you're practicing it verbally, you might practice like 10 sentences in the same time it took you to write one. So you can get a lot more practice, a lot more like at bats, and you can get feedback from a partner. It also means that you're not collecting random scraps of Post-its to, I don't know, keep at your desk all the time. So we rely on that a lot, but also you see in this case, like examples that are specifically like the whole lesson is just oral rehearsal. So pick one of these subordinating conjunctions, since the car honked, and then finish the sentence. And you and your partner could come up with a whole bunch of those just to practice making that type of sentence, and see how it works, right? Including seeing which ones don't really work. Like, whereas the car honked is probably not going to work, but even though the car honked, I still walked across the street is probably bad pedestrian behavior, but a great sentence. So you'll see that throughout. And I think that's a really powerful thing to think about in any grammar curriculum, is just how do I build in more talk? And then the other thing that I think gets built in a lot throughout, and it's probably familiar to you, but it might be worth thinking about, is revising writing. So in every single, chunk of lessons in these books, there's parts where kids are revising their own writing. But we thought a lot about what role there would be for kids revising like fake student writing or mistaken, like error ridden writing. Because certainly some of the like practices like daily oral language can cause problems where, kids don't actually correct it. So they're just copying down wrong stuff and never getting to the right stuff. So there can be issues with that. One thing that this I think is a good example of is I think it can be helpful just in a very limited sense to say, in this case, obviously the student is over capitalizing, right? She's overgeneralized the idea of capitalizing, and now she's just going crazy with it. So saying, here's this skill. I'm having trouble with, like, I'm capitalizing stuff, but I think I'm doing it too much. So let's look at, what we need to do here. And then let's help this student fix that one error. So it's not hunt for 5 random errors that you may or may not find, or you end up correcting something that was right in the first place. But instead, it's like, it's a very specific limited practice opportunity. So I think it could be worth thinking about where this fits into your practice. And if you're finding that you're doing a lot of correcting, like whole class correcting sample writing, and it isn't transferring or isn't going well, play around with making it more narrow, more specific, and see if that helps, right? So that's one of the things that we looked at quite a bit. But certainly revising their own writing, I think, is always a good thing. So I have to say I'm amazed that we are at 11:59 Eastern and we got through all of that piece. I'm going to show you one last thing very quickly, and then we're going to go, which is the other thing you'll find in here are 2 pieces. And I think, again, helpful to know if you're teaching these units, but also just helpful to think about checklist versus menu. Checklist being sort of do all these things, menu being aspirational goals. You won't be perfect at it. I think the idea of separating those 2 out was not my idea, a brilliant one, and worth considering. Like, how do we help kids do the non-negotiables and set goals that help them reach toward the like cool, fancy grammar that they're not perfect at? And I think an easy way is just separate them, right? You must use capital letters, and you should be trying to do one of these other things, but I know you won't be perfect at it, and no one's going to get upset at that. So there was your whirlwind half hour grammar in 7 minutes a day. Thank you so much for hanging in there with me. And hopefully some of that was useful to you, fun. And again, email me if you want to talk grammar research, my favorite activity, or chat about anything else, frankly. I would love to hear from any of you. Have a wonderful last session or 2 sessions. If you just came into this room, the next session here is about reading assessment. So maybe you're here for that, but if not, you're heading off to wherever you're going, and I will see you all soon. All right. Take care.
Okay.